Okay, wrong.
I know, it's like a hot shower.
So, welcome everyone to our inaugural Tea Tidings. I think inaugural means first, but maybe it doesn't. And so, I actually ended up preparing some notes for the talk because I was a little bit nervous being the first one, but hopefully they're more like a relaxed talk with interaction. And so initially I'll just introduce a topic and start chatting away, and then as we all get tea drunk on oolong, we can all chime in. So the topic of today's talk on this lovely rainy day is immortality. Lotus and the quest for immortality. And immortality is a kind of interesting idea. I think we have some more tea takers. Immortality is an interesting idea because from my understanding, there's two main ideas of immortality. One is born out of... Maybe I'll pause for a moment. Morning, everyone.
Yeah, start there. We're rolling.
Did a brief introduction, and that was basically about the topic of Lotus and the quest for immortality. And of course, immortality has two main streams at which human culture approaches it. One is out of fear, which is fear of death. So we're seeking to become immortal in a way in which we have the understanding that when we die, we don't really know what happens, and as we may have a loss of consciousness, people try to stay alive longer and longer, and of course this becomes more frantic as we get older because we think we're dying, and so there's all sorts of interesting methods employed in history to extend life and life extension, hopefully to the point where people will be able to be immortal, whatever that means. But from a perspective of love, the spiritual idea of immortality is quite different, because the spiritual idea of immortality is that the being that understands or becomes self-aware is actually more of a soul being and is immortal by virtue of the fact that it's never-ending continuation of consciousness, of cycle of consciousness, which dips in and out of physical worlds into different bodies. And so it becomes a perspective if we are a physical being having a spiritual experience, or a spiritual being having a physical experience. So the physical being having a spiritual experience is chasing immortality from a bodily perspective, and the spiritual being having a physical experience realizes they're already immortal but would like to extend the period of incarnation to share in that wisdom. And so...
Dan, can you speak up a bit louder? We've got a lot of rain noise.
Okay. So how did Lotus become associated with this quest for immortality? Because Lotus is this beautiful flower called the sacred lotus, and has been central to so many traditions, be it Taoist or Buddhist, Brahmanic, Hindu. So the Vedic traditions are looking at a lotus, and the lotus not only was being associated with Amitabha Buddha, which was a Buddha of immortality, but many other realms of immortality were looked at from an interesting lotus perspective, and an idea that the Tibetan Buddhists say that humans and lotus come from the same realm, which is lotus realm. And so there's a very close association through time with lotuses, and there was a time when in Southeast Asia, the land of the lotus eaters, which has now been shrunk to northern Cambodia, northern Thailand, southern China, Laos, are the last of the lotus eaters. And I'm going to go into a few little stories about them in a moment. But at one stage, lotus was the most cultivated crop and a staple. And so there's a suggestion that even the word paddy, rice paddies, used to be lotus, because pad or paddy is actually the name for lotus. And so you can imagine all the terraces that were being built, the flooded terraces were being built for lotus, to cultivate lotus, because rice doesn't actually need to be cultivated in a flooded field. Rice could be cultivated in dry land. It does require a lot of water, but it doesn't actually need to be in a pond or a paddy. And so the idea is, when rice was introduced, even though it was hundreds of years ago, it supplanted the lotus. And the lotus cultures were actually really peaceful cultures, and we're not sure whether that was because of the abundance of food they provided so that people didn't have to war, or whether there was something within the lotus that calmed people down. And in the land of the lotus eaters, there was a story, I think a Greek myth, where they set sail on the ocean. What were the famous Greek myths? Anyway, they set sail on this ocean, and there's a tempest, and it blows them out to sea, and they get lost and becalmed, and they run out of food and water. And so they reach a particular place where they see land for the first time, and everyone's starving and thirsty, and they send a search party to go and find food and water, and they disappear and they don't come back. And after a couple of days, they send another search party and they disappear and don't come back. And eventually the captain takes the last few sailors, and off they go, and they find the first two search parties, and they're in this land which is called the land of the lotus eaters, and they all lounging about in bliss with this tribe. And you know, the captain's like, go on, what are you guys doing? Get the food back to the ship. And of course no one wants to leave because they've found virtual paradise. And there's this idea that the lotus eating cultures have built around them this paradisical realm. So I'm going to track a little bit as to how that may have come about, and then we can talk about it. So the immortality of the body, there was a scientist called, I think, Alexis Carrel, and what he did is he took a chicken heart and he put it in an interesting kind of solution which had nutrients and enough to feed the cell, and every day they changed that nutrient broth, and the chicken heart lived for something like 25 years. And the only reason apparently it died is because one of the lab assistants forgot to change the solution. But what he had proved was that the cell in and of itself, given the right amount of nutrients and the right and being able to take away the toxins or the digestion products, you could end up with a cell that was virtually immortal. So if we've got a body that's potentially immortal and a soul that is seen as immortal, then why is this constant movement of human beings, you know, sliding towards this breakdown and death and death of the physical body and then renewal? And recently someone called Bruce Lipton published a book called The Biology of Belief, where he discusses the idea that our genetics, we're not actually beholden to our genetics. In other words, the body is not built around the genetics. The genetics are just like a grid plan for how the body is going to be built. But we can change that plan at any time. We can change the blueprint. And the largest factor to changing the blueprint was actually our belief system. So the biology of belief charts how each one of us can actually change our genetics really quickly, and we're talking over in in moments and hours and days rather than even over a lifetime. And I remember as a kid listening to a Talking Heads album, Remain in Light, I think, where there's a track that says by keeping a mental image in your mind you can actually change who you are over time. And that always really kind of resonated with me, that we can actually change who we are. So this here is a lotus seed, and within this lotus seed there's some very interesting alchemy. First of all, as a seed, this contains thousands and thousands of lotus plants. In fact, an infinite number of lotus plants, because as one plant grows, that then produces hundreds or thousands of seeds, and each one of them is a portal to thousands and thousands more seeds. So within the seed is contained all of lotus, which is an unlimited amount of energy, which is quite amazing. But what else is quite amazing about this seed is the lotus seed is known to be the seed that has survived the longest out of any seed in nature and been sprouted. So they've found lotus seeds over 2,000 years old and sprouted them, and they've come back to life. Now that's pretty amazing, because if you could see inside the seed, there's a white seed coat, but within that there's a small green lotus shoot, which is the two first leaves that come out. And they stay there in a suspended animation for essentially up to 2,000 years, but maybe longer. And then when in the right conditions, it would sprout and come back to life, and be this portal again for an infinite amount of not only food but medicine, because lotus is being used through the lotus eating cultures. Every part of the lotus is being eaten. The roots are a staple starch product. The stems get used in like a salad, like a green papaya type salad. The leaves, the young leaves, get used both as plates to eat on, which you just dispose and throw away, but also get chopped up as a vegetable. The seeds, of course, had this amazing food source, because outside it's like chickpeas, but inside the seed, surrounding that little green shoot, is a gel, and in that is contained human growth hormone. And human growth hormone, one of the only places, I believe is the only place, but there may still be more to be discovered, is the only place in nature that human growth hormone occurs other than humans, which is quite amazing, because it's through the declining amount of human growth hormone in the body that we start to actually age. So maybe this is one of the secrets to physical immortality, but probably not in the way in which we think. By tuning us resonantly into the frequency of the sacred lotus, we may be engaging in practices which awaken us, and of course at a certain level of awakening we can learn that we can change the frequency of the cellular tissue to actually move with us through time in a type of teleportation or bilocation. Now the Tibetan Buddhists have spent many years, many lifetimes, looking at this process, and there's their meditations, I think, around the idea of a rainbow body, where at the point of death, depending on one's practice, you can dissolve the body into light components and actually take the body with you into the death realm. We heard a first-hand experience of this quite some time ago. Friends of ours were in San Francisco, and a Tibetan Buddhist tanka painter had come to their house to die. Now he had got liver cancer, I think, from mixing paints on his hand, and he was in hospital, but to actually die, he chose to come and die in front of this group of practitioners to teach them about a rainbow body. And so he arrived at this place in an ambulance, in an oxygen tent, and they wheeled him in and put him on the bed, took the oxygen tent away, and he sat up and started going through his death process, breathing, pranayama and chanting, and then went silent. And what happened after that was quite remarkable from the perspective of these friends of ours. They said that the sound and light that came out of his body as he went into his final stages of death was incredible, and that everything in the house actually started to absorb this light, and everything started to glow. And the neighbors phoned and said, could you turn the music down? You know, there was an audible sound emanating beyond the house that was even heard by the neighbors. And he had told them before he went that the only thing that he could take with him would be pure gold. And so they'd given him a gold ring, and he went through his death process, and even though he didn't dissolve into nothingness or pure light, the gold ring did actually disappear. And there have been many stories of people in Tibet that have managed to actually dissolve their body entirely into light. And there have been stories of when this happens, rainbows have appeared, or sometimes two suns, and this is quite commonplace actually. So this sets the tone that it is possible for us to, at a certain point, dissolve our bodies into pure light and take them with us. And what I'm suggesting is that this cannot be done out of fear, because if we fear death and we try and develop our rainbow body out of fear of death, it always fails. And so this has to be done out of a practice of letting go of the idea of what life is, and constantly practicing or preparing for death, which of course a lot of Tibetan Buddhist practices do. Tom Robbins goes into this in a book called Jitterbug Perfume, where he has the two heroes. I read it a very long time ago, but I seem to remember the two heroes of his book travel through time and learn certain practices of bathing and breathing and eating certain foods, where they develop a body immortality, where they start becoming eternally young. And it gets them into a lot of trouble, because if you hang around people who are aging and you stay young, then after a time they think there's something, you know, amiss, and either burn you as a witch or try and pin you down to extract this immortality stuff from you. And so they had to constantly keep moving. And in more recent times there's been stories of an ancient practice called white powder gold, and the ingestion of white powder gold, which the Egyptians got into. And of course the Egyptians that built the pyramids are not the same Egyptians that are living in Egypt today. And from the hieroglyphic information, it seems like, and there's suggestions that these Egyptians were actually Atlanteans. And one of the ways in which we can tell this is a lot of the hieroglyphs show in their ceremonies, they have on an altar, they have a blue water lily, which has been called lotus, but it's actually a blue water lily which grows around this area. And it's always cut and on the altar, which is showing that because the blue water lily was the flower of Atlantis, it is now being shown as appearing on the altar, but it's always cut because it's showing that the culture of Atlantis was being transplanted, were not in their homeland. And so if you look at how much of this blue water lily appears through Egyptian culture, it's incredible. So much carving, so much of the artwork is iconic and has this blue water lily. And so even the most preserved mummy, I'm not sure it was Ramesses, chose to die with the petals and sepals of a blue water lily around his neck. And you have to ask the question, if this was one of the most powerful people in ancient Egypt, why did he actually choose, if there was all this access to gold and infinite power, why did he choose to have a blue water lily as his necklace when he died? And so there's this association with lotus and in fact blue water lily, these flowering water plants, with this idea of immortality. And I'm going to suggest that within the human growth hormone within there, and within the blue water lily that produces on its it opens and closes 3 days in a row, but the first day it opens there's a whole lot of little yellow, I think they're stamens, they actually open to form this inner temple, and within there's about 1 ml of liquid, way more than could be for any insect. And if you take a dropper or a little bamboo straw, which is my suggestion, and take a sip of that nectar, it's an amazing nectar. It actually has the quality of like an alcohol. It goes instantly into the bloodstream. You can feel it at the tips of your toes. And it has a very low surface tension. And as you sip this nectar, you can feel something happen in your body, but it's really subtle. And so I think that's just the actual physical energetic of what the quality of seeing the blue water lily and the fragrance of the blue water lily, which is what I think the Egyptians were enamored with, because it's in that frequency that there's a key, and that key is somehow related to our longevity practices through a raising of awareness or a raising of consciousness. Now there's this famous story of one of the, I don't know if you'd call it patriarchs of Tibetan Buddhism that came from Bonpo shamanism, and he was a shaman called Padmasambhava, and Padmasambhava which means lotus born. The story, from the way I understand it, had some incredible visions, and was living had moved into an area which encompassed the whole of the Middle Kingdom, which was southern China and northern India and a whole chunk of the Himalayas. And what happened was he met the king of the Middle Kingdom and fancied his daughter as a consort. And so said to the king, you know, I'd like to have your daughter as a consort. And the king wasn't very happy with this and had Padmasambhava captured and taken into a valley and burnt at the stake. And very shortly after that, the king's servants came to him and said, you better come and have a look what's going on. And so the king came down into the valley where Padmasambhava was burnt at the stake, and the valley had filled up with water. And floating on the water was this incredible lotus, and sitting on the lotus, making love to the king's daughter, was Padmasambhava. And so of course the king was quite impressed by all of this, and converted the whole of Middle Kingdom to a type of Buddhism which in that stage, and I think this was the 12 or 1300s, incorporated a lot of shamanic practice, which is where a lot of the shamanic lineages that come into Tibetan Buddhism come from, is through the lineage of Padmasambhava, the lotus born. And why was Buddha and Padmasambhava and all these and Kuan Yin standing or sitting on a lotus? You know, so they're sitting on what's on the sacred throne, which is the seed cap, which produces nuts, because of course this is actually a nut. Cocos, I mean, Nelumbo nucifera, the nucifera means nut bearing. So this is a beautiful nut. So why was it that before Buddha was conceived, his mother had a dream of an elephant taking a lotus bud and placing it in her womb? Why was it when he took his first steps, this is Buddha Sakyamuni, why was it that wherever his feet touched, lotuses grew? And I think within all this incredible religious mythology,
here comes the mighty of Seta.
is within this incredible religious or spiritual mythology comes this idea of this association of us going back to our roots, back to these lotus roots, finding a way through the lotus back to our original true nature. This clear light true nature that is described by beings who doing this intense spiritual practice is the understanding of the Lotus Sutra, of the Lotus Born, of all the chakras being lotus shape and opening. So it is the original return to the source, which is the time that we're approaching now. And so that's why I thought it would be not a bad topic to talk about at our first tea tidings. So there's I just wanted to talk about a couple of other little things. There's the Upanishads, which are thousands of years old documents, I think Brahmanic texts, and they talk about the sun and the moon and the stars all exist in a lotus-shaped temple within our heart. And so recently science has discovered that the heart is actually like a localized black hole, and so is the center of each atom. And there's a sacred geometer called Nassim Haramein who actually shows that the exact same energy or black hole that's at the center of our galaxy happens to be at the center of our sun, at the center of our planet, at the center of our heart, at the center of cells, and we actually get this microcosmic, macrocosmic, mirror-like reflection, so as above, so below. And so the Cambodians, when they built Angkor Wat, had an idea about this, and so they built this incredible temple, which is the largest, I think the largest temple complex on earth. I think it covers over 44 square kilometers. But the main temple is built up in the series of ponds, and then the tops of the temple are all these lotus shapes, and I happened to be there in a powerful downpour, and what happens is the rain lands on these structures and flows into this most incredible flow forms through the stone and gathers in these ponds. And in the Holy of Holies, the pond right at the top, there's all these from the vision I had, all these women who I think are called apsaras. And in the carvings, we're not sure whether they're angelic beings or whether they're temple maidens, but I think the difference may not be that great. And what they do is they're administering to the top pond, and what they do is they go into bliss states and ecstatic states, and through that they charge this water, and then the water then flows into these other ponds, and then lower ponds, and then into the rice paddies around. And this is where they were growing their lotus. And so they were charging the water. Not only that, the water that was coming down the Mekong and other rivers that were coming towards the temple complex, in the bedrock they carved over 10,000 lingams. And this was to actually energize and charge the water coming in. So what they were doing is they were energizing the water in which they were growing the lotus, so that when they were eating the lotus, these lotus were supercharged. And then that flowed into the Mekong, which would back up once a year and create a big dam. And that would fill with, it's I think one of the most densely populated with fish. And so this back flooding of the Mekong and the charging of the water through Angkor Wat was related to one of the most incredible temple construction complex. And what gave them the energy to do this was this amazing charging of the water, which then fed the lotus and the fish, which could create a whole culture who could dedicate all their time to building this amazing temple. So my suggestion is that the time we're moving into, it's through the abundance of nutrient-dense food that we can actually have enough energy to go through our spiritual pursuits and become the temple builders of the future. And so now I'm going to tie this lastly to oolong tea. From my understanding, oolong tea has been cultivated for thousands of years from an original tea bush that was found, an original tea tree. And the way in which this particular tea was cultured, and all tea comes from one plant called Camellia sinensis. So whether it's black tea or green tea or oolong tea, all is essentially the same plant, of which there's a highland variety and a lowland variety. The lowland variety has a broad leaf, and most black teas are made from a lowland variety. And the highland variety is a smaller leaf and prefers cooler climates. And the oolong tea was cultivated for meditation because it keeps you awake without raising the anxiety level like coffee would. And so what you would do as a meditator is you would wake up in the morning and drink some oolong tea, and what that would do was keep the mind awake and yet relaxed, which is the ultimate state for meditation. And so part of the not only that, oolong tea has these incredible healing qualities which happen to heal the body and bring the body into balance. So some teas may make you a little dry. If you have a damp constitution, you may drink a white tea. But oolong tea is famous for actually bringing the body into balance. So if it's out over here, it'll bring it back. If it's out over here, it'll bring it back. And it's from that balance that we can actually start to raise the energy in the body and start to move into these high frequency modes. And it's from those high frequency modes that we learn to develop the lotus or rainbow body, which is the quest for immortality. Thank you.
Oolong.
Oolong. Bodily pursuits of immortality went into propagating the body through the passing on of energy through procreation. And so there was an idea that cellularly we could then, if we pass on our bloodline, that lineage would then continue. And so we lived through a type of vicarious immortality by the transmission of the bloodline. And there was a lot of focus, as you can look through history, of keeping bloodlines pure and chasing bloodlines. But they could only create bodies or receptacles that were pure enough for the avatars to reincarnate, because in order to be effective in this physical realm, to be truly effective, you need a body. The problem is, once you come into the body, there's often a compromise of the consciousness that can be brought into the body, and so people forget and need to have practices or lineages to reawaken that, which is why, for example, the Tibetan Buddhists, who are quite advanced in this, would have these reincarnative processes. Hence the 14th Dalai Lama is in a lineage of Dalai Lamas. And
could you say that the knowledge then that's inhibited in that first body or whatever is then passed on through to through the knowledge that's then shared amongst peers and then amongst generations? Absolutely.
And in fact, that passing on of those seeds of wisdom, and it is seeds because they're vibrational in nature, but once passed on, once someone gets a seed, then it does start to grow and opens into whole new plants. And even though it's the same plant, there cannot be two of the same, and so each one will have its own characteristics, which correspond to, I think, what's called the terroir, which is like a combination of the water and the soil and the atmosphere and the person nourishing it, all come together to give the quality of that tea or coffee or tobacco or whatever's grown, in this case lotus or mind seeds. So those dream seeds are watered by and nourished by the ideas we have and our ancestral lineages and our parents and our friends and where we hang out on the earth and where we travel and what sacred sites we get to see, etc. All affect how that seed will grow and flower and then produce its own seed. And the reason the plant goes back to seed is for adaptability. Because if it loses its ability to go to seed, then it ties itself into a very particular lineage trajectory. For example, corn that comes from an old thing called maize, which is it's like a grass, and it has lots of little seeds, has now adapted into this beautiful large yellow thing we call corn cob. But this cannot propagate on its own anymore. It can only propagate with humans. So it's now bound its energy, and so that with humans, so that if humans were to disappear from the planet for whatever reason, corn would disappear too. And there's quite a few plants that have now woven their genetic future lineage with humans.
I was watching a documentary recently on this. I think it was looking at potatoes, tulips, and marijuana.
Right.
And apples, yeah.
So that would have been Michael Pollan's,
Yeah.
I think, Botany of Desire.
Yeah. Because the apple was, unique to one place, but now because of humans, it's everywhere.
Yeah, I think the apple came initially from the foothills of the Himalayas up, and then moved all the way. It slowly moved across west, and as it moved, it got sweeter and larger until I think it's kind of got all the way to, the Americas. And then when it first arrived in the Americas, there was there were so many different cultivars, and the story of Johnny Appleseed, and amazing story.
Yeah, but that was the human interaction with plants.
Yeah, and so when we step into our true role as human custodians of the earth, then part of our job is to take those plants and move them across and share them between cultures, which is going contrary to, for example, what happens in Australia, where there's quarantine because we're trying to keep it all endemic the way it was, not realizing that it's through that sharing of food and then other useful ethnobotanical plants that world culture springs from. If you take the list of plants that we eat daily, from avocados and pumpkins and potatoes and tomatoes and squashes and beans, and about 90% of that comes from the jungles of the Amazon. So if we were all living off bush tucker here, this land would probably not support that many people in that way. So it's the idea of keeping plant strains indigenous is a very conservative idea, and it's through that idea of conservation that there's stagnation and ultimately death. For example, the lotus that grows in Kakadu, that supports a lot of the traditional people up there, was introduced, they think that one was introduced from China about over 1,000 years ago. And so that would have been a gift, energetically, from the Chinese culture into northern Australia. And it's a gift of nutrition, it's a gift of spiritual awakening, it's a gift of everything that the lotus bears. And so as we introduce different plants to different parts of the world, if people say that they're not indigenous, they just don't understand that there's nothing that's not indigenous. There can be wrong plants introduced at the wrong time. Because there's not the cultural use, they can become weeds. But they only become weeds because there isn't a human cultural association of use with them. Yeah.
Those blue ones, those little kind of star-shaped ones, that's sort of yellow inside, and they actually wild in Australia? They grow.
Yeah, Nymphea caerulea, I think it is naturally occurring or endemic, but we don't know to what period. There are stories that Egyptians, which would have been Atlanteans, came here to Australia. There's pyramids, there's Egyptian hieroglyphs. I think in Gympie there's a pyramid, but there's a few places where there's pyramid type structures and hieroglyphs. And there's a story that the Atlanteans came here to get the blue water lily. But if you look back and say that the Atlanteans were the ones who built the pyramid complex in Egypt, maybe they brought the blue water lily from Atlantis to here as well as to Egypt, or maybe this was part of Atlantis. I don't know.
So that liquid you talked about in the blue water lily, do you know anything about that?
Only that I've drunk it and it's sublime.
Right.
It's incredible, and I'd highly recommend it. There's lots of places where there's tons of blue water lilies. Just get a boogie board or a surfboard and paddle out in the morning and just get a little straw. And it doesn't keep very long when you put it, like I've you know, taken a little dropper and filled the whole bottle, and it's probably about 5 or 7 days it starts to go off, so to speak. And I don't know if you could keep it going in alcohol or, but fresh is best. Just, you know, suck it up, suck it and see.
Is that the liquid in the stem, or is it?
No, in the flower itself. When the flower opens on the first day, because they'll open and then close that evening, and then open again about 3 or 4 days.
Okay.
And so, as they close and open, they produce different stages of like pollen. So at one stage they, so on the first day they're offering this kind of like nectar. But there's an idea that what they're offering is that nectar is to humans, not to insects, because there's more liquid in there for any insect could consume. And there's no actual insect that's coming and drinking that liquid. You know, bees will come and have a little sip, but I think that was destined for human consumption.
I think those other two are gone. If you want to say.
They're pretty good to eat, the lotus seeds, if you get them fresh. They'll have this black seed coat is green, and you can just, you know, peel it off, and there's a white thing that tastes like, if you get it just right, it tastes kind of in between, like sort of corn and young corn and asparagus type thing. It's quite sweet and crunchy.
Have you seen it prepared in any certain way? I mean, have you seen it used in cooking?
Yeah, look, in Southeast Asia you can buy dried, it'll be hulled lotus seeds, and you put them in a curry like you would chickpeas. It's very common. In Taiwan and large parts of China and Southeast Asia, the same place that the tea would come from, there's a certain time they make lotus moon cakes, and they just make pastries, tons of pastries out of lotus meal, and it's a big celebration. Do you know much about it?
The mooncake is a mooncake festival, really, and it celebrates. Well, my favourite story is it's basically the Chinese Valentine's Day, and I don't tell stories quite as well as Dan does, but I can give the details. Basically, there was a man who fell in love with a woman, but this woman had been, she belonged to the moon, and she would come down to Earth and visit now and again. And when she came down, there was no moon, because when she comes down, there's no moon. And he fell in love with her, but she said, "I'm sorry, I have to go back. I have to be the moon." And she didn't want to, because they fell in love. And then she was told by some other cosmic thing that she had to go back. So they had to split, and they could never be together. So he was so depressed, he killed himself. He drowned himself in the river. To celebrate such intense love, the Chinese nation would make mooncakes, and they would throw them into the water and into the river to feed their love. Because apparently when he went into the water, he could then go to the moon and
became a
spend
lotus.
Something like that.
And the moon reflected on the water.
I just remember the mooncakes are really, really yummy.
Yeah.
But the lotus seed is very, very common in China.
Yeah.
They make lots of things out of lotus seeds, and it's also part of the materia medica with Chinese medicine. So they would put in a lot of herbal decoctions and things and cook them up.
So you you could get it in Chinese herbal shops, maybe.
Yes.
You can get them in Chinese grocery stores.
Grocery stores.
I wouldn't know what kind of quality they would be.
Yeah.
But
You can get dried lotus seed here at Red Ginger.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But the fresh is quite different to the dry seed. And the green shoots itself, right from the center, they're the most bitter, and they, I think, have the most herbal qualities. And at one stage, it was only the emperor allowed to drink lotus tea. So there's two types of lotus teas, generally. One is made from the little green shoots within the seed, and only the emperor was allowed to drink that, because I think there was obviously something about the emperor was going for immortality, and everyone else had to kind of like just watch. And the other lotus tea is actually taking green tea which could be like an oolong, and putting it in the lotus flower. So the lotus would open on the first day, and then they'd put the tea in and it would close up, and they'd sometimes bound that lotus, and then the next day they'd come and open it up and the lotus would open up, and then the tea is infused with the fragrance of lotus. I think I may have some in the cupboard there. We made some lotus tea for the first time last year. That's some of the lotuses we're growing around here. And there's something beyond the physical form of consuming the lotus that is, you know, the spiritual key, which is the seeing it with the eyes and being able to connect with it on a different level beyond consuming it. So, like, you know, they roast lotus root to heal the lungs, but you know, and they eat lotus root in so many different forms, but it's actually the relationship to the flower which seems to be the real spiritualized aspect. And there's a lotus, like, so this is a lotus pod. Let me bring it here. So this is a lotus pod here, and then in here would normally sit all the seeds, and so the flower was at one stage like that, and then when the petals fall off, this stays there and this swells, and then you have the seeds in here, and this is the Buddha's throne. This is what Buddha's sitting on, or Kuan Yin standing on, and these little seeds, if you ever look, they look like a little breast. They've got like a little nipple, and all the nipples will stick up, and so you're sitting on this, basically this orgone energy platform, and this is, so to eat the seed is the gross way of absorbing the energy, just like eating food, whereas you can absorb the same energy subtly from breathing, from the breath through like pranayama, or even from light itself through the eyes, which is what the eyes are designed to do. And so seeing the sun, you can absorb energy directly from the sun, but seeing a lotus flower is like seeing the human realm of the sun on earth. So it's like our spiritualized aspect separated from the body. So hence the dance of consuming this ourselves. Yeah. Which is what the whole spiritualized lotus culture came from, I think. And maybe at another tea tiding I'll get out all my pictures of travelling through Cambodia and Laos and southern China through the lotus eating cultures, and just experiencing the way in which they interact with the landscape and the water and the plants, and how amazing, they're really amazing cultures, because they're still like all in traditional clothing, and they seem so happy, they're always smiling. And I mean, the Cambodians are amazing. Like, most of them were, so many of the older generation were killed, you know, during the Vietnam and Cambodian War, and so most of the people there are actually from this young generation, and it's incredible how much they all smile and laugh. You know, you'd think out of such tragedy there'd be so much sorrow, and yet they seem way happier than, you know, the general Western city.
So they must be absorbing it through...
Yeah, just all around
not the right word, but in a physical sense, through osmosis, being immersed in that surroundings.
That's what I think happens. The lotus tends to also filter the water and clean water, and so you're getting this combination of putting out a frequency, an energetic frequency, as well as, you know, being able to eat the lotus, as well as it cleaning the water. So, like you're saying, just being in that field obviously has some healing benefits, and over time that would recognized, and, you know, and then so the lotuses were then cultivated, you know, in all the temples and as temple offerings still today, in, you know, in Thailand and China, Cambodia. But it's the standard temple offering is buying lotus flowers, and they actually do this beautiful kind of flower origami where they fold the petals back, and they sell them in the flower stores coming into the temples, and so people would buy some flowers as their temple offering, lotus flowers.
So that's an interesting thought, actually. It's maybe not so much the immersion in Western culture, but they at the same time immersion in their own and older culture that keeps them in that surroundings and spiritual state, or develop in that spiritual state.
But of course we know that that every nation has a piece of the puzzle, and so that as we approach essentially the end of time as we know it, everyone has to come forward with their piece. Every individual has a piece of the puzzle, but each culture has a piece of the puzzle. And you know, those cultures, the land of the lotus eaters, I think have a very specific piece of the puzzle which relates to the spiritual flowering of human being and the quest for immortality of the body. In other words, how we can dissolve the body and take the body with us, or how we can keep the body alive cellularly for as long as we like, and then choose at a point, well, I'm going to leave the physical body. And there is quite strong evidence of past cultures who claim to have done that.
Yeah.
So do you want to tell us, if you wanted to cultivate lotus, what would be the best way to design ponds around a house, and how much light, depth, mud, how to fish with them, etc.?
So there's an interesting story. If you look at the classic, what we call the Japanese garden, it has certain elements which run through generally in the garden. There's bamboo, and there's a pond, and there tends to be a heavy stone lantern, and then within the pond there's often water lilies, but there's definitely fish, which are these water dragons, often koi. And so what happens is the bamboo, because of the lines of silica tubes, acts like a broadband. It enables the bamboo to channel vast amounts of cosmic energy into the earth. But in its raw state, that energy is kind of quite loose and wild, and so they use a heavy rock or a lantern to actually ground the energy. The pond acts as like a battery and stores that energy and makes it bioavailable for humans to absorb through their bodily senses. And so what happens is the water lilies grow within the water, and as they flower and we look at them with our eyes, we can absorb the energy. And also as the fish move in that sinuous way, their movement as we observing them is enabling us to absorb that energy. And so the basic or classic Japanese garden, which comes from the Chinese, is this idea of conducting qi in the environment and making the qi bioavailable. So where lotuses fit in is, if you want to grow lotus, they will grow quite cold, like they grow them down in Victoria and Melbourne, and you know, all the way up in Kashmir in the lake that even freezes over. They grow quite differently in the tropics to the temperate climates, and they can grow in water. They can grow in mud and water up to about 2 meters deep. And traditionally, what they would do is they would take the seeds and they scarify them. You rub them on a little bit of sandpaper or concrete or sandstone until you see like a lighter color brown, and then you just put them in water, generally like a little cup of warm water on the windowsill, and after 3 to 7 days they would sprout 2 or 3 little lotus pads and a little bit of root. And then you take them and you put them in the pond, and you want them in full sun, so the water to be quite warm and relatively shallow initially. And then you put that little seedling with 2 or 3 little lotus pads on the mud. You don't bury it in the mud because it can rot. And then it will find its way into the mud and start growing. And then one of the best things to grow them has been used is well-rotted cow manure. And of course the whole Hindu and Vedic cultures with their sacred cows, there's another whole story of the relationship between cows and sacred lotus, you know, or cows and psilocybin cubensis, you know. Cows seem to be quite instrumental in you know, the advancement of human awareness about who they are. Not by eating them.
There's a lot of blue lotus spreading around the waterways on the east coast, and they usually signal that the water's a bit acidic, and sometimes with acid sulfate runoff they just love that, and you see whole canals and creeks full of it. So like the government's considered that a signal of a problem, but how would you see a good way of using that?
Or do they alkalise the water? Are they there to balance it?
Good question. And nature tends to do that. Nature is always tending towards balance, and so that may be part of alkalizing the water. But often nature heralds the level of balance or change that's occurring. And I would say that the blue water lilies, as they spread, are heralding this flowering of human awareness or a return to the dream time. And I think within the environment, it's often very difficult for us to see. So for example, if you take another water plant, water hyacinth is seen as a weed and a pest because it blocks up waterways, but that's seen as a symptom. If you look at the root cause, the only reason that water hyacinth can grow so rapidly, because it absorbs nutrients, I think 8 to 10 times faster than any other plant. So its role in the water is to actually pull nutrient out of the water column to clean the water. So when you see lots of water hyacinth, what you actually should be saying is, how come there's so much nutrient in the water? The reason there's so much nutrient in the water is bad farming practices, loss of topsoil, too much fertilizer being used, flushing into the water systems. So you get a huge bloom of these plants, which then become weeds and choke the waterways. But really what they're doing is cleaning the waterways faster than any other plant. And so we need to actually do what they did like in Vietnam, which is go, instead of seeing this as a weed, how do we take this? And so they've made a whole commercial venture, and a whole economy has started taking water hyacinth and making furniture from it. And so there's now this incredible, like a type of wicker type furniture made from water hyacinth. And so they've taken essentially a weed and ended up cleaning the waterways and starting an economy. That's the way in which we should interact with the plant world.
There was a trial at Casino Sewage Plant where they were screening the hyacinth off. And that was a great way to get nutrients out of the sewage ponds and then use that for compost.
Yeah, exactly. And there was someone even making, I think, jet fuel from water hyacinth. So it's a fantastic soil food, and you know, we get to clean waterways and feed the soil at the same time. It's a brilliant way of returning nutrients back into the soil food web. And so I'm suggesting that the blue water lily is inhabiting these waterways, and you'll notice that to keep water quality, one of the most important things is shade. So when you shading the surface of the water, what happens is you're stopping the sunlight penetrating the water column too much, which creates it getting too warm in the day and then too cool at night. And so the temperature fluctuations, they encourage what we call weed growth, like it could be microalgae. And what they'll do is they fill the water column, and then you get green water and it can go stagnant. And so what happens is if you shade 2/3 of a pond, then what happens is all those microalgae can't function, and they actually drop out of the water column, and the nutrient ends up being more balanced. And so you don't get that much nutrient in the water column. It ends up sinking or being eaten by water plants that are root feeding, and you can get clear water and cleaner water. So part of the lily pads shading out the surface is part of cleaning up the water, as well as, you know, the roots taking up nutrients. But you know, there's lots of ways of looking at this, you know, the challenges of us butting up against the plant world and it being a weed. I think even the blue water lilies are food. I think once the flower actually sets, you get like a kind of a nut with a whole lot of seeds, and I think there are cultures that eat that too, as well as I think the stems, but I don't really know enough about it.
Yeah, one of the things we're trying to deal with too is mosquitoes, and having fish that eat mosquitoes, and having set up where the birds don't eat the fish, and like in my pond at home, that's been the big thing with kookaburras. But I found when I did have lotus lilies, they were giving cover for the fish, and they could hang in there better.
That's right.
Mosquitoes.
And that's obviously the best way to do it is to have quite complex and biodiverse water systems which support the growth of other organisms. So in the lotus ponds, the first lotus leaves actually sit on the water, and then subsequent ones come out and actually stick out of the water, which is the characteristic of the sacred lotus. And they then end up shading out other water plants which may then compete. But then of course at the end of summer and in autumn they die back and allow the sunlight to penetrate to the bottom of the pond, and so the whole ecosystem shifts over winter, and then we'll go back again in spring. They'll grow really quickly and cover the water surface, and so often the growth of sacred lotus is associated with cleaning waterways or cleansed waterways.
Tiger wants some tea.
You want some tea?
Thanks, Dan.
Very, very interesting. Thank you.